If you don't already know, I am doing an in-depth literary analysis / dissection series for the Cruel Prince series since I think like the end of April, beginning of May, and I'm actually officially done with the original trilogy and I moved on to the novellas. I finished Cardin's. I am now about to start in on The Lost Sister, which is Taryn's. But before I get into those videos, I want to explain a little bit more why I'm a Taryn apologist. While I will admit, as I am actively reading, I do get frustrated with her decisions and choices because we are reading from Jude's POV. But I want to explain why I am an apologist for her by taking you a step back and putting us in Taryn's shoes. Now, Taryn and Jude are technically guests to Elfhame. They are Maddox's guests. They are not a part of this world. And the way I equate it is like Jude and Taryn are on like work or visitor visas and they want to gain their citizenships into this world. That is their main goal for both of them. And they are told for pretty much their entire lives that there are only two ways for humans to gain their citizenships into Elfhame and Fairy. And that is either one, to have an exceptional gift like Jude is with her sword, or their father was with making weapons, or even being a magnificent musician. Like in The Darkest Part of the Forest, we have two human twins that gain their citizenships into this world because the girl's an amazing knight and the boy is an amazing musician, and it helps that he also was the lover of the king. But that is the one way of earning your way, like citizenship into this world as a human. Taryn, I think, realized pretty early on that this was not going to be the avenue for her. So she has to take the second choice, the only other choice, which is to marry into it. And that's why she studies and shadows Orenia so closely over the years, just as Jude has been shadowing and studying Maddox over the years. And for her, that's why, like in the beginning, in the Cruel Prince, she kind of declares to Jude that I'm going to fall in love. Just as like, Amy March's famous speech in the 2019 Greta Gerwig version of Little Woman, where she says, I think we have some control over who we love. And I think the poets might disagree. Well, I'm not a poet. I'm just a woman. And as a woman, I cannot, and own land property and stuff like that. And that's pretty much what Taryn is equating that to. That she is hoping that maybe eventually she'll fall in love. But she also knows Jude very well. She knows Jude is very set in her opinions, but she wants the best for Taryn. She wants her to be happy. She knows that. And she knows that the only way to have Jude believe that is to think that she had fallen in love. She wouldn't like that she's marrying to earn her way into this world, like it being an alliance. That wouldn't be enough for Jude, but it's enough for Taryn. And, the problem is that it doesn't seem like any fairies have ever really looked at them. And then Locke comes into the picture. And she is not settling. She won the jackpot with Locke because he is titled, he has land, he is the best friend of one of the princes of Elfhame. She could not have done any better than him if you take away his personality. That is the best she could have ever have hoped for. And the other problem is she does not know she will ever get another offer after this. It does not seem like she's getting any before this, and who's to say she will ever get any after this. So yes, she will jump through whatever hoops he wants if it means that she will get to marry him, because for Taryn at this moment, she is not seeking love. She has more than enough love, from her family. What she is seeking is security, which she has not had since she was a child and ripped away from the human world and existing in this kind of guest scenario in this world. Like, she has not secured her place in Elfhame yet, and this will secure her place in Elfhame. It will gain her some security in her life, and that's all she desires. And that's why Taryn's action makes sense to me. And in part, she is easily manipulated by Maddox because it is her father figure, and that's why she kind of seems like she's working against Jude. But yeah, I think she also knows that Jude loves her, that sometimes that whatever she does, Jude would still love her after, and I think she was banking on that, but her actions were based off a desperation of gaining the citizenship in this world, because as we saw with Jude and Taryn, they don't feel like they belong in the human world anymore. So that's why Taryn's actions make sense to me, and that's why I'm a Taryn apologist. I love that the story opens with Taryn pretty much being like, do you remember the fairy tale about Mr. Fox? Which there are numerous fairy tales about foxes from every culture. There's even one where a fox gets married. And it starts seeming like it might go in that direction, where she's saying on the night of, their wedding, he goes out to do something and she goes to see her new home, her castle, which then you're starting to be like, is she talking about herself? But then she's saying that she's seeing like these things like be bold, but not too bold, be bold, but not too bold, where your heart's blood should run cold. And she sees a room filled with the corpses of previous brides, which then turns into like a blueberry like essence of a story. And it's interesting that she's taking bits from all these fairy tales in her own life in a way to be able to contextualize it for herself, her experience for herself, but as a way to be able to tell it to someone else, and we, the reader, or someone else, because, you know, every story has a grain of truth to it. I love that we learn that this is first-person POV being told by Taryn, but it's styled almost like she's talking to Jude, especially where we see here where she says, I think about the story a lot. I think about it all the time. It's the kind of thing you like. The wicked are slain with swords, no less. Vengeance is had, and boldness is rewarded, which is exactly how Jude views and walks through this world. But then she says, but what about all those girls? All those obedient girls who trusted and loved and read and died, weren't they bold too? And in my opinion, yes. Because sometimes we forget that these girls are bold too, the quiet ones working almost under the radar. That there are amazing women in history that, yes, are like, you know, Joan of Arc, who are going out there in armor over a sword. But then there are the quiet ones, the ones working within the confines that society has put on them, the Eleanor of Aquitaines. There are other styles of being bold, and I love that Taryn is bold, but because we were in Jude's POV and we were kind of convinced to think that there's one style of boldness, we all hated Taryn, which I think isn't deserved. Now, you could argue that both sisters are very judgmental of the other, but if you take a step back and think about the Cruel Prince, you can see there are a lot of times where Jude was judgmental of Taryn's choices and decisions and actions, where they both actually were judgmental of their choices, decisions, and actions. And it didn't help that a lot of them, they were in the same situation and want to take different paths, which is understandable because not only as a teenager, you're trying to figure out who you are as a person and your identity, but it's made even worse when you're a twin, when you're like a copy paste of one another. And as a teenager, you're trying to force this identity, which means that a lot of times you're like strong-handing on like others and trying to force others to be like you haven't quite figured out the nuance yet. And that's where we're seeing here that Taryn didn't feel comfortable telling Jude certain things because she expected judgment from her. So Taryn doesn't outright say that she wanted to marry because this is the only way for her to get her citizenship in the world. That's the underlying truth that even like she doesn't acknowledge, we wouldn't acknowledge. But for her, she does say that her future husband was what this, like, it was stereotypical fairy tale. The stories that she grew up loving to hear and imagine for herself, especially when you're living in a fairy tale like world, how could you not imagine that that would be a potential possibility? He courted her in the old ways and it was charming and it was everything she could have hoped for. The girl who was in beautiful dresses and liked love stories. But she thought she would be fine because she thought herself clever. She thought that she had learned enough under the tutelage of Ravinia and would understood that style of court politics, that she would be clever enough if anything happened, that she could handle herself, that she could handle herself in this world, and proved herself wrong, which to me is interesting because it's a very Fox-like mistake. Yes, we connotate Locke as being Fox-like, and he is, but it's interesting that we don't realize that Taryn is equally Fox-like. And usually in fairy tales, they kind of get their comeuppance in the end. That they assume their cleverness being more than it actually is. And to continue off that previous video, further proof of that is an interaction between Taryn and Locke, where like she says that Jude was practicing her sword for the tournament. And she says Locke was coming over her shoulder as she was reading a book. And he says, how does it feel to be stuck in a fairy tale? And she says, how does it feel to be one? So obviously, she wanted to be one too. She existed almost like on the peripheries of the fairy tale, and she finally wanted to be a part of it. She wants to be a part of this world, and Locke was offering her the chance, offering her a hand through the door. I love woven throughout is Taryn just, you know, throwing in little details about the lessons that she had learned from fairy tales. That like Locke, she's living her life by stories, and it makes sense that the stories that she feels more similar to are fairy tales when she lives in this world. And so for her, she had taken the lessons and the teachings of these fairy tales Jude might have too, but she had taken the lessons and stories of the male point of views, the heroes, the knights, whereas Taryn felt more akin to the female characters, where they would sit there quietly and patiently, that they would, pick nettles so their hands bleed, that they would haul water for witches, small painful penance, but you usually win in the end, that, you share your food always, but you don't take other food that people are trying to give to you, that you're nice, always nice and polite to kings, beggars, witches, and wounded bears, but you don't ever break a promise. These are the little moralistic lessons that she had taken and internalized and had turned it into her life because she is young. She is taking what she knows, the only thing she knows, and is trying to apply to real life, and she has not lived enough of real life to have learned her lessons all just yet. I love this line that Taryn has about Vivi, because she says, "Sometimes Vivi frightened me. Sometimes for all her love of human things, she seemed entirely alien, especially when I feel like just another of the human things she loves, possibly out of the same nostalgia for her childhood that makes her yearn for mortal movies and songs and comics." And it makes sense because Taryn is a teenager. She's reaching that age where you're trying to forge your own identity, who you are outside your family. So sometimes you kind of are shoving rudely back at them to give yourself some separation, and it makes sense, especially as Taryn's a twin, but also with Vivi, who is a little bit different, who is someone that I think is secretly a little jealous that she easily can exist in this world and turns her back on it, whereas Taryn and Jude have to work harder to be a part of this world. But also, I think she's not entirely wrong. I think Vivi does love them, but there are probably moments where they are just a link to her past, this old part of herself. Now, it might seem mean that Taryn is sitting here looking at Jude and critiquing her, but she says it here, and as a reminder, throw back to the first book in the Cruel Prince, after the two of them were fighting after the Watch Coronation, when she says, "I'm a mirror." That is why she is annoyed with Jude, and it's not anything Jude has done. It's just because as twins, she is looking in the mirror. She is seeing her every flaw, and for Taryn, because she doesn't have an exceptional skill, her only way into this world is to marry. And so even though she thinks herself clever, she knows cleverness is not going to catch a boy's attention and offer marriage. She needs to be pretty, and when she looks at Jude, she says that it's impossible in this world. Maybe they would pass as pretty in the mortal world, but here they would not. They are plain here. Also, Taryn's eagerness in this moment, the excitement of having something budding between her and Locke, but it being a secret, is exciting. We see it often in a lot of romance books and other stories. We saw it with Jude when she was secretly hooked up with Carden, or she secretly was married to him. There were moments where she thought, if only I could tell Taryn that I had hooked up with him behind the throne, or that I am married to him. The thrill that she got with that secret. So it's understandable that Taryn enjoyed the excitement behind keeping her and Locke's budding relationship a secret. Taryn says here that yes, she had told Locke about Jude, and that she had told too much, that she regrets it. So a part of it is that you finally have someone listening to you, and how exciting after years of being on the outskirts and pretty much only talking with your sister, that you're not really having a conversation with fairies, and finally she can gush about everything and he's listening. But she realized that she had said too much in two senses. That one, he used it against Jude, and she realized this now, months, years later, but also that it had lured him towards her and made it more of a game, that he saw the potential of this exciting new story because she had pretty much put it out on a platter for him to pick up and use. Numerous times in a lot of my videos throughout the entire trilogy, I talked about how existing in this world is like being on drugs, that it is overwhelming for your senses, the food, the atmosphere, the music. It literally is drug-like, and that you find yourself yearning to still be a part of it even after. That's why, Jude literally drugs herself with poisons to be a part of it, drowns in it. Even Carden in his novella, I point out that he drugs himself with wines and drugs to be a part of this world too, even though he technically should have been a part of it. And we're seeing that interacting with Locke is akin to taking these drugs, that with him not being there each day, the longer he stays away from Taryn, the more she craves for it again. I really love Taryn here saying that I made a mistake. I should have realized I have been too far up in my own problems to not see that this summer tournament was your opportunity to earn your place in this world as a mortal. Just as Jude doesn't acknowledge that marrying Locke was Taryn's opportunity, she didn't acknowledge that this was Jude's. I really am enjoying that we're seeing the scene with the river when they're shoved in it in the first book, and Taryn gets out and makes a agreement with Carter's promise to kiss both his cheeks, that he won't hold it against her. People critique Taryn for that, but what she says makes sense to me, where she says, yes, there was a certain nobility in staying in the water with you. It wasn't as though it would help anything. She's recognizing that, yes, it would have been a certain nobility for both of us to be there together and stand together, but us drowning or being freezing to death isn't worth it. I'd rather take this lesser evil of agreeing to this and kissing Carter's cheek if it means that we get to live another day, that you can fight another day against him if you really want to. And that makes sense. But also it goes down to what I brought up a couple times in the first book in my videos, which is that Jude lives nobly. Nobility is such a human thing because it's a selfless thing. And Taryn has adopted a slightly more fairy approach, which is a slightly more selfish approach. They have bargains and deals. They don't do things for charity. That was a great burn from Taryn, because he was like, oh, I can see why Locke likes you. And she's like, is that a compliment? And he goes, you're awful. And the thing is that Locke and Taryn are actually more alike than it might seem, that they both like stories. Literally before Taryn came over, she was contextualizing her and, Locke's relationship into a fairy tale. And, they both use others, whereas Taryn's, she does, I feel like she has a little bit slightly more noble, reasoning behind some of her actions than Locke does. But from Carter's point of view and from Jude's and from some of the readers, it seems more selfish, which again, it makes sense. She's grown up in this world of fairy where it's more selfish, but Carter had literally just been hurt by Locke and Lucia. And he thinks that Taryn is doing the same to Jude, that she is kind of going behind her back and being mean. Also, I really love in this moment that technically, Carter's defending Jude, but Jude only sees that Taryn's crying, so she pushes him up against a tree, and it's amazing. So Locke says here, and he actually also says it to Maddox when he asks for Taryn's hand in marriage. He says that we, the folk, don't love like you do. Perhaps you shouldn't trust me with your heart. I might break it. He at least is being upfront, being like, this is the risk you're going to take. However, we also know that he's not entirely correct, that there are folk that do love, but it's not perfect. Case in point with Maddox and their mother. But, Carter and Jude go against the norm, too. But I think this is as much as Locke can love, because I can't remember exactly what kind of creature he is, but whatever he, Oak, and their mother are, they kind of live off the flirtation, the romance, as much as a red cap lives off bloodshed. But Locke grew up in an empty, cold home with no love. He didn't have any parents, he didn't have any family, no one to love him, and it just made him colder. And I think with his nature being geared towards romance, it kind of made him a little bit more bitter, more like in Mansfield Park with the Crawford siblings, how their father had cheated and stuff. They had such a negative view of romance and love, and that's why Henry Crawford manipulates and flirts with every girl. Love Mansfield Park by Jane Austen, by the way, and obviously Henry Crawford's one of my favorite characters. He's so interesting. But that's I think that plays a role, and it's interesting that he becomes colder, whereas Carter equally does not get much love in his life, yearns for it and is desperate for it and is willing to get burned time and time again if he gets a taste of any form of love. We're also seeing that part of the reason why Taryn is drawn to Locke, and even a moment Jude is because Locke has this weird skill of getting to the deep of their desires, of knowing exactly what they truly desire, and calls them out on it and offers them the opportunity of seizing it. He's like, I can help you. So of course they're gonna say yes, even if they're a little uncertain about him. Okay, I kind of love Taryn a little bit more here, where she goes to the middle of the night to Locke, and it's like, I'm gonna ruin all your fun. I'll tell my own stories and ruin the fun that you're having with Lucia and Carden and Maddox and Jude if you don't marry me. Marry me. Do this. I think it's a bad decision on her part, but once again, Locke is like a drug, and once she has had too much of a taste of it, she can't see her life without it now. It's too painful, the withdrawal. But I like that she's bold enough to be like, we're gonna get married. Okay, that was interesting. I've never actually read Taryn's novella. I've always been an apologist. I always kind of understood, but this, it doesn't justify her every actions, and it is frustrating at times. But what I'm trying to get at is that with Taryn, I understand her decisions and all the things that has shaped her to lead to these decisions, though I don't agree with her actions. But I understand where she was going, and she's young. And when you're young, you're going to make stupid mistakes. And this was her stupid mistake.